They brought Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez into court expecting her to fold, expecting a politician to sit quietly, nod respectfully, and obey the invisible rules written long before women like her were even allowed in the room. The judge was a Supreme Court justice, the setting, a federal hearing cloaked in procedure. But what they didn't expect was that one sentence, just 14 words, could tear through 30 years of silence in that very institution. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't shouted, it was spoken plainly, with the kind of clarity that doesn't ask for permission. And once it was said, there was no unhearing it. The courtroom froze, the footage leaked, and by the time the sun rose, people in all 50 states weren't just watching, they were demanding answers. This is the story of what happens when someone refuses to shrink, and what a system does when it's more afraid of a voice than a verdict. While this is a dramatized, fictional account, the emotions behind it, the fear of suppression, the courage to resist, the cost of speaking truth, are deeply real. Inspired by the challenges faced by women, people of color, and every voice that's ever been told to wait its turn. This story is for them, for you, for us. Monday began like most others in Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's office, quietly chaotic. A half-full coffee sat forgotten on the edge of her desk. Her inbox blinked with policy briefings and constituent letters, and somewhere down the hallway, someone was trying and failing to connect to a Zoom hearing. The air was thick with routine until the envelope arrived. It didn't come through the usual channels. No assistant carried it in. No courier announced themselves. It was just there, lying flat in the center of her desk as if it had always belonged there. Thick, heavy, sealed with the kind of gold-embossed emblem you don't see unless something has gone very, very wrong. She paused mid-sentence, blinking at the envelope as if it might vanish under scrutiny. Then she picked it up carefully, like handling evidence. Her thumb slid beneath the fold. The paper inside crackled. Crisp, deliberate. Not a memo, not a press request, not even a warning. It was a subpoena. Her name, in full, bold print. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. To appear before the United States Federal Judicial Committee presiding authority, the Honorable Justice Amy Coney Barrett. She read it once, then again, and a third time. Her hand tightened around the paper. Justice Amy Coney Barrett? Supreme Court justices didn't preside over congressional hearings. That wasn't just unusual. It was unprecedented. It blurred lines that weren't meant to be blurred. It was the kind of thing they taught you in civics class should never happen. She leaned back in her chair, eyes scanning the rest of the document. But it was vague by design. No specific allegations, no listed charges, just the soft thread of formality, and the unmistakable scent of something orchestrated. She reached for her phone. Get Luis. Her legal advisor, Luis Mejia, picked up after the second ring. She didn't waste time. Since when does a Supreme Court justice preside over congressional testimony? There was a pause, then, they don't. Not unless someone wants it to look like law when it's really theater. A beat. Then he added, this is a trap, Alex. Her jaw tightened. They're not just investigating, he said, his voice low, measured. They're making you the example. She stood and began pacing, the subpoena still in her hand, her heels tapping a steady rhythm across the polished floor. I've seen games before, she said. But they're coming after your credibility, Luis said. Not with lies, with optics. She stopped pacing, stared out the window toward the Capitol dome. They want me on camera, she said quietly. They want me cornered, emotional, reactive, and they want it to look constitutional. Exactly, he said. They don't need to win. They just need to frame it. She didn't respond right away. Just stood there, the gold seal catching the light, trembling slightly between her fingers. A sudden question surfaced in her mind, sharp and unfamiliar. What happens when the people who write the rules decide to bend them? And you're the one standing in the way? She looked down at the subpoena again, her name, their authority, the weight of it all pressing against her like a dare. Her phone buzzed again. A meeting reminder she wouldn't attend, because Monday morning had started with policy memos, but it would end with a line being drawn. And the question now wasn't if she would cross it, it was whether they were ready for what came next when she did. The messages came in quietly. No official briefings, no stamped letters, just fragments, half sentences from trusted names. People who had spent decades navigating the corridors of power, who knew when something looked wrong before it ever made the news. One came from a former federal judge. Off the record. Watch the jurisdiction. It's thin, purposefully. Another from a constitutional law professor she once debated on national television, now simply read, "They're setting precedent through you, and not the good kind." AOC didn't respond. Not yet. She read them all in silence, her phone resting against the same subpoena that still lay open on her desk. A quiet threat dressed in legal dignity. She hadn't told the media. No statements, no social posts, not even a hint of concern to her staff. She knew how fast panic could spread, and how easily the narrative could slip from her hands the moment she blinked too hard. For now, it stayed between her and the three people she trusted most: her legal counsel, her longtime policy aide, and herself. Luis had stayed late, poring over the subpoena with highlighters and red tabs, muttering under his breath like someone trying to disarm a bomb by memory. "There's no charge here," he'd said. "No statute named. Just language about testimony relevant to judicial integrity." What does that even mean? Integrity isn't a crime. But she already knew. It wasn't about crime. It was about framing. And not just of her, but of what resistance looked like when it came from the wrong voice, in the wrong room, at the wrong time. She sat alone now, the office empty, long past dusk. The Capitol dome glowed faintly in the distance, framed by rain-blurred glass. The halls were quiet, the kind of stillness that only comes when people are too tired to keep pretending things are normal. Her eyes fell again on the gold seal, that perfect, polished emblem that always felt like it represented something greater. Justice, order, balance. Now it just felt heavy, like a warning disguised as invitation. She thought of other fights, the committee hearings where she was talked over, the viral clips where her voice cut through laughter, the nights she went home shaking, not from fear but from holding it all in. And still somehow this felt different, not louder, not rougher, but colder, cleaner, engineered. She leaned forward, elbows on her desk, hands folded, not in prayer, but in calculation. Her reflection hovered faintly in the window, younger than she felt, sharper than they assumed. And then she said it, not loudly, not bitterly, just enough for the silence to hold it. "They're not summoning me to speak. They're summoning me to break." There was no drama in the statement, just truth, the kind that settles in the chest and doesn't leave. She didn't know yet what Barrett's role truly was, whether the justice believed in this hearing or was simply presiding over a script written by more invisible hands. But AOC knew this much. They weren't aiming for a confession. They were aiming for a crack, something small, a moment of emotion they could loop endlessly on cable news. A clip, a meme, a mistake. And in that awareness came a rare kind of clarity. If they were going to use her voice to rewrite the rules, then she would choose every word like it was the last one they'd ever silence. They gathered in the small windowless conference room on the third floor. No press, no noise, no distractions. Just AOC, her legal team, and 3 hours of strategic tension. The walls were lined with dry erase boards filled with timelines, precedent rulings, potential traps. Luis stood near the door, arms crossed, flanked by printed documents marked with yellow and red tabs like battlefield maps. "Here's what they want," he began, pointing to a mock schedule of testimony. "You walk in ready to fight. They poke. You push back. They clip it, reframe it, and suddenly you're the one undermining decorum, not them." AOC said nothing, but her fingers tapped lightly on the table. "Don't let them bait you," another advisor added, her voice softer, more urgent. "You need to stay steel, not cold, not quiet, just unshakable, like they're not getting under your skin." It wasn't bad advice. In fact, it was smart, strategic. But something about it made AOC feel like she was already losing something before she had even walked through the courthouse door. They talked for another 45 minutes about body language, tone, rest breaks, legal limits. She nodded, took notes, asked sharp questions. But somewhere around the fifth procedural memo, she closed the folder and stood up. "I need a moment," she said. She walked back to her office alone, dimming the lights on the way in. The Capitol dome still glowed through the window, but tonight it felt distant, like something symbolic, not structural. She sat down, opened her laptop, and for a while, just stared at the blinking cursor. Then slowly, she began to type. The words came in bursts, polished, powerful, pre-approved. She'd been trained to do this. Open with poise, layer in facts, land with emotion. Avoid reactive language. Don't repeat the opposition's framing. Control the narrative. 20 minutes in, she had a full page of lines that sounded strong, certain, clean. She read it once. Then she highlighted it all and deleted it. Not because it was wrong, but because it wasn't real. She leaned back in her chair and exhaled, long and steady, the kind of breath that empties out more than lungs. She didn't want to bring armor into that courtroom. She didn't want pre-scripted strength. She wanted something else, something far more dangerous. Clarity. No shields, no mask of political elegance, just the truth, as plainly as she could bear to speak it. She closed the laptop, pushed it aside. "I won't bring prepared lines," she said aloud to no one. "Just the truth." No one answered, but the silence around her felt different this time. Not lonely, but honest. Like the storm hadn't come yet, but it had started watching. The next morning she dressed in navy blue. No white, no symbolism, just something clean. Her team offered to drive her. She said she'd walk. So she did. Down the stone steps, across the wet sidewalk, past the waiting vans and the shutter clicks of long-lens cameras. No entourage, no statement, just Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walking into the storm. Not armored, not afraid, just ready. The courthouse was colder than she expected. Not in temperature, but in tone. The kind of cold that settles into walls, that isn't caused by air vents, but by the history of who usually stands in the rooms and who doesn't. AOC felt it as soon as she crossed the threshold. The polished marble floor, the echo of every step. The uniformed guards who didn't speak, just watched. Outside, the media gauntlet had been relentless. Cameras captured each movement, from the way her coat hung over her arm to the stillness in her eyes. Journalists shouted questions she had no intention of answering. She had given them nothing but posture and silence, and yet the footage would loop on air for the next 6 hours anyway. Every frame dissected, every blink given motive. Inside it was quieter, but not gentler. A clerk escorted her down a long corridor, past frosted glass doors and oil portraits of men whose names had long outlived their legacies. No conversation, no eye contact, just motion, rehearsed and practiced. When they reached the chamber door, the clerk paused. "You'll sit at the front, second table. Counsel's already inside." AOC nodded once. She didn't need directions. She'd studied this room before it became her stage. She stepped in. Justice Amy Coney Barrett was already seated on the bench, high above the room's polished floor, robed in black, her expression unreadable. The stillness around her was almost sculptural, as if the room existed to amplify her presence and minimize everyone else's. Their eyes met. It wasn't long, a second, maybe two, but it was enough. There was no warmth, no nod of recognition, just a silent exchange. One woman representing an institution built to endure, the other a voice known for disrupting what institutions prefer to leave untouched. AOC looked away first, not from deference, but because she chose to. She sat at the table, placed her hands deliberately on the surface, fingers interlaced, palms down. She didn't adjust her blazer. She didn't glance at the cameras positioned discreetly in the corners. She simply looked ahead. The room began to settle. Whispers faded, paper shuffling stopped. Someone closed the doors. Barrett spoke. "This hearing is now in session," she said, her voice clipped, practiced and distant. Let the record reflect that the witness has appeared as summoned. This is a federal proceeding. Disruption will not be tolerated. Deviation from decorum will be noted, and consequences will be immediate. The final word landed with weight, not a threat, a warning. AOC didn't flinch. Louise, seated beside her, passed a single folded note. She opened it without looking down. It said only, "Stillness is power." She didn't write back, because she already understood. This wasn't a legal process. It was a stage. Every word she said, and didn't, would be clipped, quoted, and circulated before nightfall. The court reporter positioned her fingers above the keys. A prosecutor cleared his throat. And just like that, it began. No opening ceremony, no introductions. Just a gavel, a glance, and the quiet sound of power drawing its lines. The first few questions were dry, predictable. They came from a junior prosecutor, thin voice, cautious cadence, and they followed the kind of script that AOC had anticipated. Her understanding of legislative oversight, her role in drafting certain ethics reforms, her public support for judicial transparency. She answered calmly, succinctly, nothing dramatic, just enough to appear cooperative, but not enough to be forgettable. For a moment, it almost felt routine. Almost. Then came the shift. The prosecutor adjusted his posture. His fingers tapped once on a folder labeled only with her name. When he looked up again, something had changed. Not visibly, but rhythmically. The room felt tighter. The tone turned. He cleared his throat. "Congresswoman," he began, "on June 5th, 2 years ago, you tweeted, and I quote, 'Too often the justice system doesn't protect the people, it protects its own.' Do you still believe that?" AOC didn't look surprised. She had known they'd come armed with her words. What she didn't yet know was how far they'd go to twist them. "I do," she said simply. "I believed it then. I believe it now." The prosecutor nodded, like checking a box. "And in that same thread," he continued, flipping a page, "you referred to courtrooms as, quote, 'sanctuaries of selective silence.' Do you still stand by that language?" Louise shifted beside her, but AOC didn't glance over. "I said it," she replied. "I meant it. I stand by it." There was no hesitation in her voice, just clarity. And that, perhaps more than anything, unsettled the room. A soft rustle moved through the gallery. A reporter scribbled faster. A camera repositioned. Barrett leaned slightly forward, her eyes narrowing not in shock, but in scrutiny, like a teacher waiting for a student to say something regrettable. The prosecutor stepped closer. "And would you say your presence here today, in this courtroom, under this process, reinforces or undermines that belief?" The question wasn't about law, it was bait. Still, AOC didn't blink. "I'd say it speaks for itself." A few heads turned. Barrett's gavel struck once, sharp and echoing. "Congresswoman," she said, her tone clipped, "you are to answer questions directly. Commentary is not appropriate." AOC nodded, not out of obedience but acknowledgement. "Understood." But the message had landed, not just in words but in posture, in the unshaken calm of someone who refused to retreat behind apologies. The prosecutor continued. Questions now came faster, tighter. They referenced her speeches at rallies in Brooklyn, her appearances on late-night television, even her sponsorship of a bill challenging the influence of dark money in federal appointments. It was no longer about her judgment. It was about her presence, about whether someone like her, young, bold, Latina, unapologetically progressive, had any business speaking this plainly in a room draped in tradition. And yet she didn't raise her voice. She didn't fold. She simply answered, each response brief but never small. Because what they wanted wasn't just control of the narrative. They wanted control of the tone. And AOC wasn't giving them either. The prosecutor's next question came too smoothly. He didn't look up from his folder when he asked it, a signal that he already knew the impact it would have, or at least hoped he did. "Congresswoman, in your October speech at the Union Justice Forum, you stated that many courtrooms today serve less as guardians of fairness and more as galleries of performance. Given that, are you suggesting that your presence here today is illegitimate?" There it was, Not just a question, a corner, designed to trap her between accusation and concession. AOC didn't flinch. She leaned in slightly, not toward the microphone, but toward the moment. "This isn't oversight," she said, calm but unmistakably direct. "This is a performance, and I'm not here to play the part you've written for me." A collective inhalation passed through the courtroom like a breeze cutting across a still lake. Louise tensed beside her. One of the junior clerks near the rear blinked in surprise and looked up from her notes. Even the stenographer hesitated, fingers briefly hovering above the keys. Justice Barrett reacted instantly. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez," she said sharply, her voice rising for the first time. "You will stick to yes or no responses. This is not a campaign rally." AOC didn't raise her voice in return. Instead, she sat taller, eyes locked forward. "You don't silence dissent by calling it disorder," she replied evenly. "You just make it easier for others to pretend they're doing the right thing when they're only maintaining the script." The room didn't explode. It froze. No shouts, no rebuttals. Just a still, heavy silence thick with the realization that something had shifted. Not legally, but culturally. A sentence had been spoken that wasn't meant to survive this room, but it had. Barrett stared at her, gavel still in hand, as if debating whether to wield it again. The prosecutor stood motionless, mouth slightly parted, uncertain whether to proceed or retreat. The entire room seemed caught between protocol and pulse. In the gallery, a young reporter silently reached for her phone. She hadn't planned on recording, but her instincts kicked in. She tapped once. Record. Somewhere near the back, a former law clerk, now turned blogger, whispered to a colleague, "That clip will go viral in 10 minutes. They were wrong. It took 4. Within minutes, a 14-second segment of AOC's response had been uploaded, captioned, and shared across platforms with titles ranging from "AOC dismantles courtroom theater" to "She just said what everyone else was thinking." By the time the hearing paused for its midday recess, hashtags were already trending. Cable news anchors began citing the clip as breaking news. Commentators scrambled to give it context. But context didn't matter. What mattered was the moment. Raw, unrehearsed, undeniable. Inside the courtroom, Barrett remained silent. She did not rebuke further, nor offer instruction. The room resumed, but the tone had changed. Everyone could feel it. A tension no longer controlled from the bench, but awakened from the witness stand. AOC said nothing more for the remainder of that hour. She didn't need to. The line had already landed. And outside the building, where a few dozen quiet observers had gathered under the gray morning sky, phones buzzed with the same notification. AOC just broke the silence, and the internet heard it first. The second morning felt heavier, not because of headlines, but because of what hadn't yet been said. AOC arrived early, far before the press pool. She sat in the back corner of a conference room across the street from the courthouse, a legal pad in front of her, untouched. The lights were dim. The coffee had gone cold. Her team surrounded her, quieter than usual, as if the walls themselves were listening. Louise broke the silence first. "They're going to escalate today." She looked up. "They won't come at you with law," he said. "They're going to come with tone, with traps. They'll push you, interrupt you, try to draw heat, and when they get it, they'll call it a meltdown." Another advisor chimed in. "We've seen it before. Passion framed as aggression, calm recast as arrogance. You know the game." OC didn't answer right away. She stared at the blank legal pad, then slowly closed it and pushed it aside. "They're trying to push you into outbursts," Louise repeated. "They don't need a legal win. They just need a headline." She nodded once, not with worry, but with memory, because she knew this pattern. She'd lived it. When she was first elected to Congress, they called her naive. Then when she proved she understood policy, they called her dangerous. When she asked sharp questions in hearings, they accused her of being disrespectful. When she showed restraint, they painted her as cold. And when she dared to speak plainly, they always called it too much. She thought of those early days, walking into rooms where her presence alone shifted energy. Staffers whispering behind folders. Cameras that lingered longer on her face than anyone else's. Lawmakers twice her age and 10 times her funding, dismissing her with tight smiles and patronizing praise. One had once said to her in a closed meeting, "You've got fire, but fire burns fast." She'd smiled politely at the time. Now she let the memory pass through her without flinching. "This isn't my first ambush," she said softly, not to reassure them, but to remind herself. Luis leaned back in his chair. "Then we treat it like a pattern, not a surprise." "We let them swing," another advisor added, "but you don't swing back." "Not in the room, not yet." "No," AOC replied, standing slowly. "I don't swing in the room. I speak." Her voice was calm, controlled, the kind of stillness that doesn't ask for quiet, but commands it. Outside the building, reporters were already lining up. Commentators were recycling yesterday's clips with half-informed analysis. A few sympathetic voices had emerged on the evening shows. But so had the usual warnings. She's making this political. She's here to provoke. The narrative was forming, but it wasn't fixed. And AOC knew the only way to shape it was not to react, but to reveal. So she stepped into her coat, tied it at the waist, and looked around the table. "They want an outburst," she said, "but they'll get clarity." And with that, she walked out, not bracing for the storm, but stepping back into the center of it. The lights dimmed slightly as the projector flickered to life. A blank white screen descended from the ceiling of the courtroom. Clean, clinical, calculated. AOC didn't move. She already knew what was coming. "Exhibit C," the lead prosecutor announced, holding a remote in his hand. "A video clip from June of last year. A public event. A rally," the image appeared. A sunlit stage, cheering crowds, a younger AOC with a microphone in hand. She was wearing a simple black blazer, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her voice steady as she spoke to hundreds gathered at a pro-choice demonstration. The video was clipped, trimmed to just one sentence. "If institutions refuse to listen to the people, then the people have the right to disrupt the institution." There was no context. No mention of the Supreme Court ruling she was responding to, nor the state-level restrictions that had triggered national protest. Just that line, isolated out of its moment, served as evidence. The prosecutor paused the video and turned to face her. "Congresswoman, do you still believe disruption is an appropriate response to disagreement with the courts?" AOC's eyes remained forward. "I believe democracy doesn't exist without the right to dissent." "That wasn't my question," he said. "I answered it," she replied. A beat of silence. Then Barrett's voice cut through the room. "Congresswoman, you will answer the question directly or face a formal warning. We are not here to litigate speeches." AOC turned her head slowly, meeting the justice's gaze. Calm, unflinching. "With respect," she said, "you brought the speech into this courtroom." "Not me." Barrett narrowed her eyes. "You're approaching contempt, Congresswoman." There it was, the line, the threat, spoken with robes and rank, but unmistakably personal. And yet AOC did not raise her voice. She didn't lean back or break pace. She simply sat forward, not with aggression, but with weight. "Truth only becomes dangerous," she said clearly, "when power tries to punish it." The words dropped into the room like a stone into water. No one moved. Even the prosecutor hesitated, unsure whether to speak or step back. Luis shifted in his seat, preparing to interject, but AOC held out her hand slightly, just enough to signal, "Not yet." She wasn't finished. "I've been to rallies," she continued. "I've held microphones. I've criticized rulings. And I'll keep doing it. Because outside these walls, people live with the consequences of decisions made by people who may never see those lives firsthand." Barrett raised her gavel. It hovered in her hand, not yet struck, but visible. "The witness will cease editorializing," she said. "This is your final warning." AOC looked away from the bench and back to the screen, which now sat dark and blank again, like a window someone had tried to peer through, but couldn't. She leaned back, folded her hands, and said nothing more. But she didn't have to. The moment had already been marked, because everyone in that room, from the clerks to the gallery to the watching press, had just witnessed something too sharp to edit out. A courtroom not trying to find facts, but trying to contain the clarity of someone unafraid to say them. The silence in the room had become dense, almost physical. No one whispered, no one moved. It felt like the air itself was bracing for what came next. Then Barrett lifted the gavel, and this time, she didn't hesitate. "This court finds the witness in contempt," she said, each word clipped and final, like a verdict carved into stone. The sound of the gavel striking wood echoed louder than it should have, like the chamber itself recoiled. For a half second, no one reacted. Then two officers stepped forward, deliberate, trained, mechanical. The movement was smooth, but it wasn't quiet. Their shoes tapped rhythmically against the floor, each step sounding like a warning wrapped in uniform. AOC didn't look at them. She stood, not quickly, not defiantly, just with a kind of certainty that refused to ask permission. The officers hesitated. They weren't sure what came next. There had been no precedent for a sitting member of Congress being charged with contempt in such a public, politically charged hearing. Their eyes flicked toward Barrett, but she said nothing more. She didn't have to. The machinery was already moving. AOC looked ahead, not at the justice, not at the prosecutors, but into the middle distance, as if addressing something older than the courtroom itself. Her voice, when it came, was calm, barely above a breath, but it carried. "You're not punishing disorder," she said. "You're punishing refusal." A murmur stirred in the gallery, not loud but undeniable. A journalist's pen froze mid-sentence. One of the clerk's eyes darted toward the press section. The stenographer hesitated, then kept typing, fingers stuttering only slightly. Louise stood as well, mouth opening as if to object, but stopped. AOC hadn't asked for a defense. She was offering a statement. The officers took another step, closer now. One reached gently for her elbow. Professional, careful, respectful in posture, if not in purpose. She allowed the contact, but didn't break eye contact with the back wall, where the blank projection screen still hung, still dark, still empty. The cameras caught every moment. Someone in the media row, a younger reporter from an independent outlet, had been live streaming quietly from a pocket device. Others snapped into action now. Shutters clicked, devices lifted. No one shouted. They didn't need to. The image was powerful enough on its own. AOC standing, composed, hands at her sides, not shouting, not resisting, just refusing to yield. Barrett did not speak again. She didn't look at the officers. She didn't look at the gallery. She stared ahead as if nothing unusual had happened. As if the optics, the consequence, the weight of what had just been set into motion were somehow beneath her concern. But outside those walls, the world was already reacting. Within 2 minutes, the clip hit Twitter. 4 minutes later, it was trending. Headlines flashed. AOC charged with contempt. Justice Barrett orders removal. AOC's final words go viral. By the time AOC was led through the hallway and down the marble steps, social media had fractured into firestorms. Some outraged, some gleeful, but many, many more deeply unsettled. Because it was no longer a hearing, it was a message, and millions had just heard it. By the time AOC was seated in a holding room deep beneath the courthouse, the outside world had already changed. The hashtag #Stand with AOC wasn't just trending in the United States, it was trending globally. From teachers in Seattle to activists in South Africa, timelines were flooding with the same 14-second clip. Her standing, poised, defiant, speaking a single sentence that refused to apologize. "You're not punishing disorder, you're punishing refusal." It didn't matter whether people agreed with her politics. It didn't matter whether they had ever voted blue or red. What mattered, what shook people, was the image of a sitting member of Congress being walked out of a courtroom, not because she had rioted or raged, but because she had spoken with too much clarity for the room to contain. Analysts across the political spectrum began dissecting the footage within the hour. "She didn't disrupt," one legal expert said on CNN. "She resisted. And there's a difference." Another added, "This wasn't a loss of decorum. This was the system recoiling at being questioned by the wrong voice, in the wrong body, at the wrong moment." Clips of those commentaries began circulating almost as quickly as the original footage itself. In editorial rooms, producers scrambled to re-edit segments scheduled for that night's shows. In newsrooms, headlines were rewritten mid-sentence. Suddenly, it wasn't about whether AOC had stepped out of line. It was about where the line had been drawn and who had moved it. Civil rights groups were among the first to respond. The NAACP issued a statement within 3 hours, calling the charge of contempt deeply concerning and the removal of AOC from court a stain on judicial neutrality. The ACLU's post was even more direct. This is not about rules. This is about power. And who's allowed to speak truth to it without punishment? Statements poured in from feminist legal collectives, immigrant rights coalitions, student movements, and international watchdogs. What started as an American moment had begun to resonate across borders, language barriers, and ideological lines. And then came the unexpected voices. A retired Republican senator tweeted, "We may disagree on policy, but silencing a public official for speaking plain truth? That's not law, that's fear." A conservative columnist, usually known for mocking AOC's speeches, wrote in a rare op-ed, "It's easy to call her theatrical, but this wasn't theater. This was restraint meeting repression, and the cameras were rolling." Inside the courthouse, Barrett stayed silent. No press statement, no clarifications. Her chambers declined all comment, but silence too was now a statement. By evening, AOC's image had become more than a headline. It had become a symbol of what happens when resistance doesn't scream, but simply refuses to shrink. And behind every share, every repost, every forwarded clip, one question simmered just beneath the surface. If this is how the system reacts to calm defiance, what is it truly built to protect? It began with a file, just under 4 minutes long, sent anonymously to 3 different newsrooms after midnight. No watermark, no source, no demand for credit, just a direct recording of the courtroom, uncut, unedited, unsparing. The footage began not with chaos, but with silence. AOC's voice in the video was low, deliberate. She was calm, firm. There was no shouting, no gesturing, no theatrics. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't interrupt. She didn't defy protocol with volume or gestures. She simply refused to step back from what she believed to be true. Barrett's voice, in contrast, was sharper than the public feed had captured. Her tone clipped, her interruptions frequent, her warnings increasingly personal. Without the courthouse camera edits and without the broadcaster commentary layered in afterward, the moment stood on its own, clearer than ever. There was no need for interpretation. The footage spoke plainly. AOC hadn't disrupted the court. The court had been uncomfortable with her composure, and almost instantly, the conversation changed. Legal scholars were the first to respond, fast, forcefully, and without hesitation. In law journals, blogs, and media op-eds written overnight, the same phrases began to repeat. This isn't contempt. This is censorship under legal veneer. Barrett's reaction wasn't about preserving decorum. It was about preserving control. AOC committed no procedural violation. What she disrupted was expectation. By dawn, dozens of prominent attorneys, former judges, and professors had gone public, calling for an immediate review of the hearing. Several cited possible ethical violations. A few went further, questioning whether Barrett should have recused herself from the case entirely given its political implications. The footage traveled fast, not through headlines, but through personal inboxes, private group chats, and quiet reposts. It wasn't viral in the flashy, algorithm-driven way. It was viral in the way that truth is when people recognize it for what it is. And still, AOC said nothing. At 7:42 a.m., she was released from federal custody. No handcuffs, no press statement, no podium. Just a plain coat, a closed mouth, and a silent walk toward a black vehicle that waited at the curb. The press followed in a slow, disorganized wave. Photographers walking backwards, trying not to miss the moment. Reporters calling out questions she never acknowledged. She didn't flinch. Her hands remained at her sides. Her chin was slightly lifted. Her expression unreadable. It wasn't triumph. It was clarity without apology. Inside the car, she didn't ask for a phone. She didn't scroll. She didn't check the headlines. She just sat in silence, the way people do when they know the worst part is over. But the real part is just beginning. And in homes, classrooms, offices, and courtrooms across the country, people were watching that footage, many of them for the second, third, even fourth time. Not because it was entertaining, but because it was revealing. It showed them what power does when it's challenged calmly, and what truth looks like when it refuses to bend. That morning, no statement needed to be made. The video had already done it. The car ride was silent at first, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling, not because there's nothing to say, but because too much has just happened. The lawyer sitting beside her glanced occasionally, unsure whether to break the stillness. Eventually he did. "They overplayed their hand," he said quietly, as if the words were heavier than he meant them to be. "The footage made it clear. Even the legal commentators are siding with us now. Some are calling it judicial intimidation." AOC didn't nod, didn't smile. She just kept watching the city blur past the window. After a moment, she replied, almost to herself, "Let's make sure it matters." Those 5 words shifted something in the air. Not anger, not vengeance. Intent. Her phone vibrated on the seat beside her. Dozens of messages, articles, threads tagged with her name. But she didn't pick it up. Not yet. There would be time to read, time to respond. But for now, what mattered was what came next, not what had just passed. Across town, in a quiet corner of a public library, a teenage girl sat with her earbuds in, staring at the leaked courtroom footage on her phone. The angle was shaky, clearly from inside the room, but the audio was crisp. She watched AOC standing still, hands at her sides, eyes focused, voice unwavering. She heard the gavel slam. She saw the federal officer step forward, and then she heard it. That one sentence. "You're not punishing disorder. You're punishing refusal." The girl paused the video, rewound, played it again, and again. She didn't say anything, just stared. Her eyes wide, lips pressed together, chest rising slowly. Behind her, her mother browsed the nonfiction aisle, unaware of what her daughter was watching. Unaware that in this exact moment, something irreversible was shifting. Not in history books, but in someone's sense of what was possible. Back in the car, AOC finally picked up her phone and opened the group chat with her inner circle. The messages were flying. 60 million views in under 8 hours. Barrett's approval rating just dropped by 9 points overnight. "We need to prep a response, something calm, but sharp." Civil rights orgs want to hold a joint press conference. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she opened her notes app and typed a single line. "When power demands silence, truth becomes its loudest threat." She stared at it, not to publish it, not yet. Just to remember it was hers. That evening, she walked through her district without security, without cameras, just a wool coat, her hands in her pockets, in the faint hum of a city still figuring out what had just happened. People didn't rush her. They looked up, paused, nodded. Some whispered her name like it was a question. Others didn't speak at all. They just watched. Watched her walk, not as a headline, but as a human being who had stood still while the storm tried to swallow her whole. And somewhere, in some living room, a young girl still held her phone. Still watching, still learning, still feeling that unfamiliar surge that rises in the chest when you realize someone like you didn't flinch. No speeches, no applause, just resolve. Because sometimes what breaks through isn't the fire of rebellion, but the quiet decision not to bend. Monday morning broke not with sunlight, but with strategy. At exactly 9:03 a.m., AOC's legal team filed a blistering emergency motion with the D.C. Circuit Court, a demand to vacate the contempt charge and a formal request that Justice Amy Coney Barrett recuse herself from further involvement in the proceedings. The motion wasn't wordy, it didn't need to be. The title alone was designed to send a shockwave through Washington. This wasn't adjudication. It was retribution. It opened with calm but piercing language, citing case law and judicial ethics codes that many in the public had never read, but which now felt urgent, relevant, and personal. Inside the courthouse, whispers swirled like autumn leaves in a sudden gust. No one had dared file something like this against a sitting Supreme Court justice in decades, and certainly not one handpicked by a partisan majority. But there it was, bold as brass. And what shocked observers most wasn't just that it had been filed. It was who stood behind it. 74 constitutional law professors from Yale, Columbia, Berkeley, Howard, and the University of Chicago signed a supporting letter that accompanied the motion. Each line in the letter cut like tempered glass. Judicial impartiality is not optional. It is the bedrock of legitimacy. Justice Barrett's conduct risks undermining public faith in the independence of the judiciary. A courtroom is not a cage for dissidents. It is a forum for fairness. We do not endorse political spectacle. We endorse the rule of law. Cable news anchors scrambled to book legal experts as the letter made front-page headlines before noon. The New York Times called it a once-in-a-generation rebuke. CNN simply headlined, "The Judiciary on Trial. Barrett faces backlash over AOC contempt case." Meanwhile, inside AOC's modest office, no one celebrated. They worked in quiet, determined focus, fielding calls, refining press statements, and preparing for the next hearing, whether it happened inside a courtroom or on the floor of public opinion. AOC sat with her chief counsel, flipping through printed copies of the scholar letter. "These signatures," she said softly, "they're not just scholars. They're witnesses." "To what?" the aide asked. She didn't look up. "To how far a system will bend to silence a voice it's afraid of." That line, "a system afraid of a voice," would end up going viral later that night, after a junior staffer tweeted it with a screenshot of the motion's headline. Within hours, it was trending on both X and Threads. Teachers printed it and taped it to bulletin boards. Organizers whispered it at rallies. One podcast host called it the sentence that cracked the marble. Meanwhile, the federal court system had to do what it loathed most: respond quickly. By midweek, the court issued a statement confirming they were reviewing the merits of the emergency motion. And just like that, the question was no longer whether AOC had overstepped. Now the question was, had a Supreme Court justice weaponized the bench to suppress dissent? Somewhere in the high towers of power, a chill ran down someone's spine. Not because they feared chaos, but because for the first time in a long time, truth had filed paperwork. The room was silent, save for the sound of rustling paper and the subtle clink of porcelain cups being set down. Inside a vaulted chamber on the third floor of the E. Barrett Prettyman Courthouse, a panel of 6 senior federal judges sat in heavy-back leather chairs. The curtains were drawn. No media, no transcripts, no live stream. This was not a hearing. This was a reckoning. The motion from AOC's team had arrived with weight, and now that it carried the signatures of 74 legal scholars and had sparked a civil media wildfire, the judicial conference was left with no choice but to address the unthinkable. A Supreme Court justice, one of their own, accused, not in theory, but in firm legal language, of judicial overreach bordering on retaliation. For 2 hours, the judges reviewed footage, reviewed precedent, and reviewed their own doubts. No one raised their voice. That wasn't how this space worked, but silence could shout when used properly, and today it did. Meanwhile, throughout the hallways of the courthouse, court clerks began whispering. It started with glances, then with hallway questions. "Have you seen the motion? Is it true she threatened contempt over a quote? Why didn't she recuse in the first place?" Even law interns, the quiet, over-caffeinated backbone of judicial machinery, noticed something unusual. Judges who usually barked orders were walking slower, more measured. Even the elevators moved with an unspoken weight. Back in the chamber, Judge Everett Manning, an Eisenhower appointee and the oldest on the bench, finally cleared his throat. "If this were a district judge," he said, "they'd already be under investigation." Another judge, younger and more media-aware, added, "The footage is now evidence, not commentary. The public has seen it. We're behind." Still, no formal decision was made. The judiciary moved slowly on purpose. Deliberation was its shield and time its armor. But one thing had become clear. Not to the press, not yet, but to those in the room. This was no longer about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It was about whether the justice system could discipline itself before the public demanded to do it for them. Outside, Barrett's office remained locked. No aides were seen entering or exiting. No statements were released. Her name was absent from court schedules. The woman who had opened the hearing with such precision, such control, now disappeared into strategic silence. Reporters stood like statues outside the courthouse gates, phones ready, waiting for a word, a look, anything. But Barrett offered none. She wasn't hiding. She was calculating. In a quiet email to her senior clerk, she had written just one line: "Let them assume what they want." Silence has its own gravity, but even silence, when it lasts too long, begins to collapse in on itself. And inside the courthouse, gravity was shifting. Young clerks swapped internal memos about past cases of recusal. Paralegals discussed judicial ethics over vending machine coffee. And behind every closed door, the same thought flickered like candlelight. If the system won't speak now, will the people force it to speak later? No decision had yet been made, but the courthouse had changed. Not with a bang, not with a ruling, but with a stillness that said something massive was beginning to move. It came not with ceremony, but with a 3-page PDF quietly uploaded to the court's public record site at 9:13 a.m. No press conference, no televised statement, just a headline on the docket. In the matter of United States versus Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, contempt charge vacated. Within 3 minutes, screenshots of the document went viral. At 9:16 a.m., MSNBC cut away from a scheduled segment on inflation. At 9:17, CNN flashed a red banner: "Breaking, contempt ruling against AOC overturned." By 9:22, the White House press secretary was being asked whether President Biden had prior knowledge. She did not, but the document spoke clearly, in the kind of sharp surgical language that legal minds would spend weeks analyzing. This court was used not to preserve order, but to punish dissent. Such use constitutes not a function of justice, but a distortion of it. The ruling didn't just reverse a contempt charge, it redrew the lines of acceptable power. Cable anchors fumbled through legal interpretations. Some gasped on air while reading the second page, where the court subtly but unmistakably referenced the Supreme Court's own code of ethics. No one, not even those robed in final authority, may substitute discipline for debate. It was a shot across the bow. And though Amy Coney Barrett's name was not explicitly cited, everyone knew who the ink was meant for. On Capitol Hill, silence reigned. Some Republican lawmakers canceled their morning interviews. A few Democratic aides popped open bottles of Topo Chico in celebration, but quickly realized the tone of the moment was not triumph. It was reckoning. In New York, AOC sat in a narrow office surrounded by her core team. The notification buzzed on her phone just as she was pouring coffee. She froze. Then she read and reread. Across from her, her legal counsel let out a long breath. "It's done." "No," AOC said, setting down the mug. "It's only beginning." She didn't smile. There was no fist pump, just a tightening in her jaw, the look of someone who had walked through a storm and come out soaked but still standing. By noon, legal think pieces flooded the internet. The New York Times posted a banner headline: "A court corrects itself and shakes the system." Civil rights advocates called it a historic acknowledgement of institutional misuse. Constitutional scholars labeled it a rare moment of clarity from a judiciary that too often hides behind process. But perhaps the most powerful response came not from academia, but from a teenager named Lila Gonzalez, who posted a 45-second TikTok that got 3 million views in 2 hours. They tried to shut her up with a charge. They ended up writing a page in history instead. That clip would later be replayed at rallies, fundraisers, even in classrooms. For now, AOC issued no formal statement. She simply reposted the court's ruling, the full 3 pages, with a single caption: "Let the people read what power tried to bury." And the people did read, some in anger, some in awe, some in silence, but all with the shared understanding that something in the air had shifted. This wasn't just a case dismissed. It was a mirror held up to a system, to a bench, to a country. And though it started with one woman being silenced, it now roared with a chorus that couldn't be unheard. The folding chairs were mismatched. The carpet was stained with old coffee. One fluorescent light flickered overhead like it hadn't worked properly since the Clinton administration. The podium? There wasn't one. Just a metal microphone stand borrowed from the youth theater across the street. This wasn't Capitol Hill. This was the East Bronx Community Center, where a much younger Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez used to volunteer after college, tutoring civics, organizing coat drives, helping seniors fill out benefit forms. Now she stood in front of the same walls, aged with time and memory, holding a piece of paper she didn't plan to read from. No camera crews had been invited. No aides surrounded her with flashcards or message discipline. Just a few dozen folding chairs, half full. But by now, hundreds of thousands were watching through phones held by community members live streaming from the back row. She took a breath. "I didn't want to do this in Washington," AOC began, "because what's happening isn't just about Washington." She scanned the room, pausing when she saw Mr. Hernandez in the second row. The man who once taught her how to run a voter registration table back in 2012. "This isn't about me," she said slowly. "It's about who gets to speak in this country and who gets punished for doing it." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I didn't walk into that courtroom because I was above the law. I walked in knowing full well that power doesn't like to be questioned, especially by a Latina from the Bronx who didn't go to Yale." There was a pause, then a murmur of agreement. "But here's the truth," she continued. "I wasn't asked to testify. I was summoned to surrender. They didn't want answers. They wanted an example. Something they could make public, loud, and humiliating enough that the rest of you might think twice before speaking up." She set the folded paper down. "That's the part no one wants to say out loud. That fear isn't always enforced by law. Sometimes it's enforced by spectacle." The room was dead quiet, not from shock, from understanding. She moved from behind the mic and stood in front of the first row now, looking people directly in the eye. "But if there's one thing we've learned from the last few weeks, it's this. The louder they punish you for the truth, the more the world leans in to listen." An older woman near the back, wearing a t-shirt that read, "Dignity is not optional," nodded slowly and wiped her cheek. "I came back here to say this where it matters," AOC said, "because it's not going to end with me. You're going to hear louder cries to silence dissent, more subtle ways to reshape the truth." She paused. Her eyes flicked to a teenage girl in the corner, holding a poster board with a handwritten quote. "Truth doesn't need a robe to speak." AOC smiled. "So the question isn't, what will they do next? The question is, what will we refuse to be silent about?" And with that, she stepped back. No closing slogan, no applause lines, just the gentle clack of someone setting their phone down, and the quiet realization in the room that something had changed. Not in Washington, but right there, in a neighborhood center with a broken light, where truth had found its voice. Again. The next morning, Alexandria sat at her small kitchen table, the one with mismatched chairs and a chip in the corner that never quite sanded down. A pile of mail sat in front of her, letters, packages, envelopes, many of them creased from having been carried in the pockets of nurses' scrubs, the inside flaps of school bags, and the palms of strangers who had finally found a reason to write. She hadn't opened any yet. Not until now. The first letter was from a nurse in Tulsa. "I watched you stand there and not flinch. Every time I advocate for my patients and get told to sit down, I remember your face. You reminded me I'm not too loud. I'm just unheard." Alexandria stared at the page for a long time, her thumb brushing over the ink like it could keep the moment alive a little longer. The second was from a high school junior in Detroit. "They suspended me for walking out during the pledge last year. I didn't think anyone cared. But after seeing what they did to you for just saying what's real, now I know I wasn't wrong. Just early." She read another, then another. Some were typed, some were scribbled on notebook paper with smudged pencil and hearts over the eyes. One came on stationery decorated with apples, from a teacher in rural Georgia. "When you said, 'They're not summoning me to speak, they're summoning me to break,' I stopped the video, and I cried, because it's what they've been doing to us too." Quietly, you just said it out loud. By the fifth letter, her shoulders started to shake. Not from grief, from recognition. These weren't fan letters. They weren't thank yous. They were echoes from people who'd been told they were wrong for simply saying something was. She picked up a pale blue envelope, the handwriting slanted and tentative. It was from a girl in San Bernardino, 13 years old. I didn't know I was allowed to say no until you did. That was when the tears finally came. Not dramatic, not public, just the quiet kind that fall when something too big finds its place inside you. Alexandria held the letter against her chest. She didn't know this girl's name, just that her world had shifted because someone else had said no first. And isn't that how movements really begin? Not with podiums or protests, but with permission. With the moment someone sees someone else stand and whispers, "If she can, maybe I can too." She turned her head to the window. Outside, a mother was walking her son to school. He wore a backpack that looked too heavy for his frame, but he moved with a little bounce in his step, like something was lighter today, like the air had changed. Alexandria reached for another envelope, because these weren't just letters. They were proof. Proof that courage is contagious, that one voice raised at the right time doesn't echo alone. It multiplies. And for the first time since the courtroom, since the gavel, since the cameras and the glare, she smiled. Not because it was over, but because she could already hear what was coming next. 3 weeks after the verdict, tucked in a high school classroom on the outskirts of Albuquerque, a civics teacher named Mr. Trejo dimmed the lights and pressed play on a recording. On screen, AOC stood in a courtroom, flanked by tension and silence. Her voice, calm, unyielding, cut through the stillness. 23 juniors watched, heads tilted, phones tucked away. The usual boredom curiously absent. In the back row sat a girl named Selena. She didn't speak much in class, but she always watched everything, every gesture, every pause. And on that day, something shifted behind her eyes. After the bell rang, she walked straight to the library, asked for an envelope, borrowed a pen. The letter wasn't long. "Hi, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. We watched your hearing in our civics class. Everyone got quiet when you spoke, even the boys who always joke. Our teacher said you weren't just answering questions. You were teaching the room how to ask better ones. I never thought anyone from where I'm from would speak like that. I just wanted you to know. We saw you, and I think we understood." It was signed shyly, Selena R., age 16, future voter, hopefully. 2 weeks later, a reply came, written on plain stationery, no headers, just a note, handwritten. "Dear Selena, thank you. Sometimes when you speak up, all you hear back is silence. Sometimes they call that failure, but it's not. If one person heard me, really heard me, then it mattered. And reading your letter, I know it mattered. But here's the thing, your voice is the next chapter. Don't wait to be allowed to speak. Speak because it matters. With respect and belief, AOC." Selena didn't show the letter to many people. Just her mom, then her teacher. Then without a word, she taped it to the back wall of the classroom next to a quote they'd painted on the bulletin board last semester. A quote by AOC herself. "Don't wait to be allowed to speak. Speak because it matters." By Friday, kids were asking to read it during breaks. Some took pictures. One boy who never raised his hand started scribbling notes in the margin of his workbook. The following week, he volunteered to lead a community service project. A few months later, that same classroom held its first ever student-led forum on local policy. It wasn't mandatory. Still, nearly half the school came. Some students spoke, others listened, but everyone walked out with something new. A name, a question, a fire. And there, in the corner of the room, framed and under glass, hung a single letter. Not from a famous celebrity, not from a textbook, but from someone who had faced power, held her ground, and left something behind that couldn't be erased. Not by gavel, not by silence, not by fear. A letter that didn't end in a period, it ended in possibility. Because that's how movements start, not with a crowd, but with one voice, heard. It was raining, the kind of rain that doesn't slam or roar, but falls with a whispering steadiness, like a slow unraveling. AOC stood on the marble steps of the courthouse, the same place where weeks earlier she had entered under a storm of cameras, questions, and commands. But today, there were no headlines, no gavel cracks, no pointed fingers waiting to accuse. There was only the quiet rhythm of rain tapping against stone. In her. no umbrella, no entourage. Just her navy coat slowly darkening, raindrops threading down her sleeves like ink on parchment. She tilted her face upward, letting the drizzle touch her skin without flinching, as if to remind herself she was still real, still standing. A small crowd began to gather at a distance, reporters unsure if this was a statement or simply a return. A few younger faces stood farther back, phone cameras raised but quiet, waiting. A clerk inside the building recognized her, paused behind the glass doors, watched. AOC didn't move for nearly a minute. Then she spoke, not to the cameras, not even directly to the people around her, but to the space itself, as if the air had earned the right to listen. They told me to answer with yes or no. They asked questions but weren't prepared for truth. They called orders sacred, but used it like a shield, not for justice, but for silence. She paused. The rain deepened. I didn't raise my voice to echo, she continued. I raised it to stay. And somehow it did. There were no applause lines, no fiery crescendo, just words that landed and lingered, like the rain, soft but sure, reshaping even the hardest surfaces. She turned to leave, took one step down, then another. The marble glistened under her boots, slippery but solid. A teenage girl in a hoodie called out gently, "Congresswoman?" AOC turned, eyebrows raised. The girl didn't ask for a photo, didn't launch into praise. She simply said, "Thanks for not leaving the room." AOC smiled, not a politician's smile, a person's. She nodded, then walked down the remaining steps, not into a motorcade, but into the rain, the sidewalk, the city. Back into the country she had refused to be quiet for. Inside the courthouse, behind those glass doors, the clerk finally moved, picked up a notepad, jotted something down, a phrase, a thought, a reminder. Out loud but softly, she repeated the words to herself. I raised it to stay. The rain had barely stopped when the microphones returned. Outside the Bronx Community Center, a swarm of reporters had gathered, huddled under canopies and camera rigs. Their voices collided in a blur of urgency and opportunism. Do you believe Justice Barrett abused her authority? Should she resign? Will you be filing an ethics complaint? The questions hit like hail, sharp, repetitive, demanding. AOC stood at the makeshift podium, her hands resting lightly on either side. No prepared remarks, no cue cards, only her presence, and a silence more potent than most speeches. She waited for the noise to thin, then looked up, not at one reporter, but at the horizon beyond them. I understand why you're asking, she said, but I want something bigger than retribution. There was a collective shuffle of lenses and pens. I want systems fixed more than I want people punished. That one sentence shifted the tone. It wasn't the answer they wanted, but it was the one they needed. Clear, purposeful, and impossible to sensationalize. She went on slowly, her voice never rising. Because the next person they summon won't have my microphone, or your attention, or a camera in the room. That's who I'm speaking for now. A reporter from a right-leaning outlet asked bluntly, So you don't think Barrett did anything wrong? AOC blinked, lips pressing into a near smile. You're asking the wrong question, she replied. The right one is, how did we get a system where one voice can both accuse and punish without accountability? A pause. And how many others have been silenced the same way, but didn't have a platform to walk away from it? That landed, hard. A second journalist, older, quieter, followed up. Would you support a review of judicial oversight? AOC's reply was immediate. Yes, and not just because of what happened to me, but because we cannot keep pretending that power checks itself. There was a stirring in the crowd, not of noise but of reflection. Even the camera operators had stopped adjusting their angles. The footage they were capturing now wasn't flashy. It was steady, grounded, a kind of leadership that didn't shout. It anchored. One young reporter near the back raised her hand. Congresswoman, she asked gently, do you regret how any of this played out? AOC looked down for a moment, then up again, her expression thoughtful. I regret that it took this for some to start asking the right questions. Then she stepped back. The press tried to shout a final round, but she didn't respond. She gave a single nod, a signal not of finality, but of transition, of moving forward. The questions she didn't answer hung heavier than the ones she did, and somewhere in a nearby cafe, a television replayed her remarks. A woman watching whispered to her daughter, "That's how you speak when you're not just trying to win the moment, but trying to change the next one." The marble steps of the courthouse glistened with leftover rain. No cameras followed now. No aides trailed behind. No podium waited at the bottom. Just Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, walking alone, hands in her coat pockets, a slow exhale rising in the morning air. The chaos had passed. The votes, the statements, the press cycles, the charges were gone. The headlines had shifted, but the story, hers, hadn't ended. Not really. She paused at the last step, where so many had once shouted at her, judged her, measured her worth by volume, posture, conformity. She looked out. Just across the street, barely visible through the fogged window of a city bus, a teenage boy was watching. He didn't hold a phone or take a photo. He just watched. And then he nodded. Once. Just once. She smiled, not because of him, but because she knew what it meant. This wasn't about spectacle. It never had been. It was about whether a voice could survive what was designed to erase it. She kept walking, but slowly now. The voiceover would come not from her lips, but from the place deeper than speech. You don't silence a voice by removing it. You silence it by making people forget it ever mattered. But not this one. This one stayed. In a civics class miles away, a young girl stared at a paused clip on the projector screen. AOC standing tall in the hearing room, not shouting, not folding, just refusing. The teacher asked the class, "Why do you think this moment mattered?" No one answered at first. Then the girl in the back raised her hand and said, "Because she didn't flinch, even when they tried to make her small." Elsewhere, in a nursing home in the Bronx, a woman in her 70s turned to her daughter and said, "They tried to teach us quiet, but that girl, she teaches something else." Back on the street, AOC passed by a mural. Her own face painted not in glory but in grit. The quote underneath wasn't one of her speeches. It was something she'd whispered off camera years ago. The point isn't to speak loudly. The point is to speak clearly and still be heard after they stop listening. She touched the edge of the wall gently, then turned a corner and vanished into the crowd. No entourage, no ceremony, just footsteps that refused to disappear. The final shot, a public library window. Inside, taped to the glass, a handwritten note in block letters. "If they couldn't silence her, maybe they can't silence me either." And below it, her name. Not in bold, not in neon, just present. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.